She was bartered away like cattle to pay her stepfather's gambling debts, sold to a whiskey-soaked brute who treated women like broken horses to be beaten into submission. But when an Apache warrior with wolf gold eyes emerged from the desert shadows and spoke a single word that changed everything, even the devil himself would learn that some souls cannot be owned, only earned. The cards fell like autumn leaves, each one sealing 17-year-old Clara Belle's fate with the casual cruelty of men who had never known hunger. The saloon reeked of stale tobacco and broken dreams, its sawdust floor stained with whiskey and blood from a dozen forgotten fights. In the corner, beneath a painting of a half-naked woman whose eyes seemed to follow the room's occupants with silent judgment, two men played a game that would destroy a life. Silas Hartwell's hands shook as he laid down his final card, the ace of spades, black as his soul and twice as worthless in this moment.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Across from him, Brock Garrison smiled with the satisfied cruelty of a man who had just acquired exactly what he wanted. Garrison was everything the frontier bred in its darkest corners, massive, mean, and drunk on power that came from owning the largest cattle ranch within 300 miles of Perdition Creek. Well, well, Garrison drawled, his voice thick with whiskey and malice. Looks like Lady Luck's finally decided to smile on old Brock. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his considerable bulk, and studied the cards spread across the table like a vulture examining roadkill. That's a mighty interesting hand you got there, Silas. Mighty interesting indeed. Hartwell's face had gone the color of week-old milk, beads of sweat gathering on his forehead, despite the cool October evening. He'd been Clara's stepfather for barely 3 years, ever since he'd married her widowed mother. But in that short time he'd managed to gamble away everything they owned, the general store, the house, even his wife's wedding ring. Now Martha Bell lay cold in the ground, taken by consumption the previous winter, and her husband had found one last thing to wager. Now Brock, Hartwell stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, maybe we could work something else out. I got other assets, other ways to settle this debt. Other assets? Garrison's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. Silas, you sorry son of a bitch. You ain't got 2 pennies to rub together. Your store's been shuttered for months. Your house belongs to the bank. And that nag you call a horse ain't worth the bullet it'd take to put her out of her misery. He leaned forward, his pale blue eyes glittering with an unholy light. But that stepdaughter of yours, now she's got potential. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Hartwell's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, his conscience fighting a losing battle against desperation. Clara is... She's just a girl, Brock. 17 years old. Her mama made me promise. Her mama's dead. Garrison cut him off with brutal efficiency. Dead and buried, and you're about to join her if you don't settle this debt. You owe me $4,000, Silas. $4,000 that you ain't got, and we both know it. He picked up his whiskey glass and drained it in one gulp, then slammed it down with enough force to crack the wood. But that girl of yours, she's worth every penny. Pretty little thing with those green eyes and that fire-red hair. She make a fine addition to my household. The way Garrison said household made it clear he had no intention of employing Clara as a cook or a seamstress. Hartwell knew exactly what the man was proposing, and the knowledge sat in his stomach like a lead weight. But the alternative was worse. Garrison's men had been known to collect debts in ways that left families mourning their dead. Outside the saloon, the wind howled through Perdition Creek like the voices of the damned, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. The town had earned its name honestly. It was the kind of place where decent folks went to disappear and evil ones went to thrive. Built around a natural spring in the middle of the Arizona Territory's most unforgiving desert, it existed as a way station for cattle drives, a haven for outlaws, and a feeding ground for predators like Brock Garrison. Clara Bell stood in the shadow of the saloon's swinging doors, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. She'd followed her stepfather here against his explicit orders, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. The conversation she'd overheard confirmed her worst fears. Dressed in her Sunday best, a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, now faded but clean, she looked impossibly young and vulnerable in the harsh lamplight spilling from the saloon's windows. "I need more time," Hartwell pleaded, his voice cracking like a boy's. "Just give me another month, Brock. I got prospects, opportunities coming up. Time?" Garrison stood up slowly, his massive frame casting a shadow across the table that seemed to swallow the light whole. "You had 3 months, Silas. 3 months to come up with my money, and instead you pissed it away on more card games and rot-gut whiskey." He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. "This here's a promissory note, signed by your own hand. It says right here that if you can't pay your debt in full by October 15th, I get to take compensation in whatever form I see fit." Hartwell's eyes fixed on the document with the fascination of a rabbit staring at a rattlesnake. He remembered signing it. Of course remembered the whiskey burning his throat and Garrison's smooth voice promising easy money and easier terms. He'd been desperate then, with Martha coughing up blood and the doctor demanding payment up front for medicine they couldn't afford. The irony that his wife had died anyway, leaving him with nothing but debts and a stepdaughter he'd never particularly wanted, wasn't lost on him. "The girl's got no family besides me," Hartwell said weakly, making one last attempt at negotiation. "No place to go if something happens to her. Folks might ask questions, let them ask." Garrison replied with a shrug that spoke of supreme confidence in his own untouchability. "This is my town, Silas, my territory. The sheriff takes his orders from me, the judge owes me money, and the preacher knows better than to poke his nose where it don't belong." He folded the promissory note and tucked it back into his vest, then fixed Hartwell with a stare that could have frozen hell itself. "Besides, accidents happen all the time out here. Deserts full of dangers, Apache raiders, wild animals, floods. Young girl could disappear real easy, and nobody would think twice about it." The threat was delivered with such casual malevolence that it took Hartwell's breath away. He'd known Garrison was ruthless, but he'd underestimated just how far the man was willing to go to get what he wanted. The realization that he'd not only gambled away Clara's freedom, but potentially her life, as well hit him like a physical blow. Clara, listening from the shadows, felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. She'd heard stories about Brock Garrison's ranch, whispered tales of women who went there and were never seen again, of screams that carried on the desert wind, of shallow graves scattered across his vast property like seeds of evil. The Apache called his spread the place where women cry, and even the hardened cowboys who worked the cattle drives gave it a wide berth. "I can't," Hartwell whispered, his last shred of decency making one final stand. "I can't do this to Martha's girl. She'd come back from the grave to haunt me. She might." Garrison agreed with a cold smile. "But you'll be alive to worry about it. Cross me on this deal, and you won't be." He signaled to 2 men who'd been sitting at the bar, nursing their drinks and pretending not to listen. They stood up with the fluid grace of predators, their hands resting casually on the butts of their pistols. "Boys, why don't you help Mr. Hartwell understand the seriousness of his situation?" The larger of the 2 men, a scarred brute called Snake Morrison, grabbed Hartwell by the collar and hauled him to his feet. The smaller one, a Mexican gunfighter known only as Diablo, drew his knife with practiced ease and placed the tip against Hartwell's throat, just hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "You got until sunrise," Garrison said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than a man's life. "Bring me the girl, or my boys here will be digging your grave before the cock crows. And Silas?" He leaned in close, his breath reeking.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Of whiskey and corruption. If you try to run, I'll hunt you down like a dog and make sure you die slow. Then I'll take the girl anyway, and she'll spend her last days wishing you'd made the smart choice tonight. They released Hartwell so suddenly that he collapsed back into his chair, gasping and clutching his throat. Garrison tossed a few coins on the table, payment for the whiskey, as if the evening had been nothing more than a pleasant social call, and walked toward the door with his hired killers flanking him like hellhounds. Clara pressed herself deeper into the shadows as the three men emerged from the saloon, her heart hammering so hard she was sure they could hear it. Garrison paused on the wooden sidewalk, his pale eyes scanning the darkness with the instincts of a born predator. For a terrifying moment, Clara thought he'd spotted her, but then he turned and walked toward his horse, a massive, black stallion that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. "Remember, Silas," Garrison called over his shoulder, as he swung into the saddle with surprising grace for such a large man. "Sunrise. Don't disappoint me." The three men rode out of town at a leisurely pace, their horses' hooves echoing off the false-fronted buildings like gunshots in a tomb. Clara waited until their silhouettes had disappeared into the desert night before emerging from her hiding place, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd witnessed. Inside the saloon, Hartwell sat alone at the poker table, staring at the cards scattered across its surface like the pieces of his shattered life. The other patrons had melted away during the confrontation, sensing violence in the air and wanting no part of it. Even the bartender had found urgent business in the back room, leaving Hartwell alone with his conscience and his terror. Clara pushed through the swinging doors with a bang that made her stepfather jump like a guilty thing. His face went white when he saw her, then red with shame and anger. "Clara, what in God's name are you doing here?" "I told you to stay home," I heard. "Everything," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake of fear and fury shaking her insides. "Every word, Silas. You sold me. Like I was a horse or a piece of furniture." Hartwell couldn't meet her eyes. "You don't understand, girl. You don't know what kind of man Garrison is, what he's capable of. I know exactly what kind of man he is," Clara shot back, her green eyes blazing with an inner fire that would have made her mother proud. "The question is, what kind of man are you?" The words hung between them like a blade, sharp and cutting. Hartwell opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, realizing that there was nothing he could say that would justify what he'd done. Nothing that would excuse trading an innocent girl's life for his own worthless skin. "We have to run," Clara said suddenly, her mind racing through possibilities and discarding them just as quickly. "We'll take what we can carry and head for California, or maybe Colorado. There's nowhere to run," Hartwell replied with the hollow voice of a man who'd already died inside. "Garrison owns this territory, Clara. He's got friends in every town, contacts on every trail. He'd find us within a week, and then—" He shuddered at the thought of what would happen then. Clara stared at her stepfather with something approaching contempt. In the space of a single evening, he'd revealed himself to be everything she'd suspected, but hoped wasn't true: a coward, a drunk, and a man who would sacrifice anyone and anything to save his own worthless hide. "Then I guess I'm on my own," she said with a calmness that surprised them both. "I won't go to Garrison willingly, Silas. If he wants me, he'll have to take me by force." "Clara, please," Hartwell begged, reaching for her hand. "You don't understand what you're saying. Garrison's got a dozen men working for him, all of them killers. You're just one girl. I'm Martha Bell's daughter," Clara replied, pulling her hand away from his grasping fingers. "And she didn't raise me to roll over and die just because some drunken fool gambled away my freedom." With that, she turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving Hartwell alone with his guilt and his terror. The desert night embraced her like a familiar friend, its harsh beauty a stark contrast to the ugliness she'd just witnessed. Above her, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering but somehow comforting in their permanence. Clara Belle had no idea that her defiant words had been overheard by more than just her cowardly stepfather. In the shadows across the street, golden eyes watched her with interest and something that might have been respect. The Apache warrior had come to Perdition Creek on business of his own, but fate had just dealt him a hand he couldn't ignore. The girl with fire-red hair had spirit, and spirit was something he understood. More importantly, she was about to become the property of Brock Garrison, and that was something he simply could not allow. Not again. Never again. Dawn came to Perdition Creek like a judgment, painting the desert sky the color of dried blood and casting long shadows that seemed to reach for Clara Belle with grasping fingers. She stood in the doorway of what had once been her home, clutching a worn leather satchel that contained everything she owned in the world: her mother's Bible, a silver locket with Martha's faded photograph, and the last $5 from the general stores till Silas Hartwell cowered in the corner like a whipped dog, his bloodshot eyes darting between Clara and the window, waiting for Garrison's men to arrive. He'd spent the night drinking what remained of his whiskey supply, hoping to find courage at the bottom of a bottle, but discovering only more shame and self-loathing. His hands shook as he reached for her, one final attempt at the affection he'd never been capable of showing. "Clara girl, maybe if you try to please him, maybe he won't hurt you too bad," he whispered, his voice cracking like old leather. "Rich men like Garrison, they get bored easy." Maybe after a while, the slap came without warning, Clara's palm connecting with his stubbled cheek with a sound like a gunshot. The force of it sent Hartwell stumbling backward, more from shock than pain, his hand rising to touch the red handprint she'd left on his face. "Don't you dare," Clara hissed, her green eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to light the dim room. "Don't you dare try to make this seem like anything other than what it is. You sold me, Silas. You bartered away a 17-year-old girl to save your own worthless hide. And now you want to give me advice on how to survive it?" Hartwell opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat as the thunder of approaching horses filled the morning air. Through the cracked window, they could see Brock Garrison riding at the head of a column of armed men, his black stallion prancing with barely contained violence. The rancher sat his saddle like a conquering general, his pale eyes fixed on their humble dwelling with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand straight and tall. If she was going to face the devil himself, she'd do it with her mother's dignity intact. She smoothed down her faded blue dress, tucked a wayward strand of red hair behind her ear, and walked to the door with her head held high. "Clara, no." Hartwell called after her, but she ignored him completely. He was already dead to her, a ghost haunting the ruins of the man her mother had foolishly believed she could save. Garrison dismounted with theatrical flourish, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with the authority of a man who'd never been challenged. His men remained mounted, forming a semicircle around the small house like buzzards waiting for something to die. Clara recognized several of them from wanted posters that had passed through the general store: Snake Morrison with his scarred face and dead eyes, Diablo Rodriguez with his silver-studded gun belt, and Three-Finger Jake Malloy, who'd allegedly killed 12 men in fair fights and twice that many in unfair ones. "Well, well," Garrison said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a snake oil salesman. "If it ain't Miss Clara Belle, looking pretty as a picture in her Sunday best." He approached the porch with the confident stride of a man who'd never been told no, his pale blue eyes traveling over her body with an appraisal that made her skin crawl. "I do believe you've grown even prettier since I saw you last, darling. Time's been kind to you." Clara bit back the words she wanted to say, that time had been kinder to her than it had been to him, judging by the additional weight He carried around his middle and the broken veins that mapped his nose like tributaries of corruption. Instead, she simply stared at him with the cold dignity her mother had taught her, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "Mr. Garrison," she said evenly, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her insides. "I believe you have business with my stepfather, not with me." Garrison's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass, sharp and cutting. "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, sweetheart. You see, your stepfather and I concluded our business last night. Fair and square, all legal and proper." He reached into his vest and withdrew the promissory note, unfolding it with the ceremony of a man unveiling a work of art. "This here document makes it clear that you belong to me now, lock, stock, and barrel." The words hit Clara like physical blows, but she refused to flinch. "I don't belong to anybody, Mr. Garrison. I'm a human being, not a piece of property to be bought and sold." "Well now, that's a matter of legal interpretation," Garrison replied with mock seriousness. "See, according to territorial law, unmarried women under the age of 21 are considered wards of their male guardians. And your guardian just signed you over to me in settlement of a debt." He folded the document and tucked it back into his vest, then fixed her with a stare that could have frozen hell itself. "So you can come along peaceful like, or my boys can make it interesting. Your choice, darling." Clara's mind raced through possibilities like a trapped animal seeking escape. She could run, but Garrison's men would run her down before she made it 50 yards. She could fight, but she was one girl against a dozen armed killers. She could scream for help, but Perdition Creek wasn't the kind of town where decent folks involved themselves in other people's troubles. As if reading her thoughts, Garrison gestured toward the main street, where a handful of townspeople had gathered to watch the show. The blacksmith, the barber, the banker, all of them keeping their distance, their faces carefully neutral. Clara realized with sinking heart that not one of them would lift a finger to help her. In Perdition Creek, Brock Garrison's word was law, and his money bought silence as surely as it bought loyalty. "Smart girl," Garrison said, interpreting her stillness as surrender. "I knew you'd see reason. Now why don't you gather up whatever you want to bring with you, and we'll be on our way. I got a nice room all prepared for you at my ranch." The way he said room made it clear that it would be more prison cell than bedroom. Clara clutched her satchel tighter, her knuckles white with tension. She was about to speak when a new voice cut through the morning air like a knife through silk. "She's not going anywhere with you." Every head turned toward the sound, and Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. Standing in the shadow of the general store's awning was a man unlike any she'd ever seen. Tall and lean as a whip, he moved. With the fluid grace of a predator, his presence commanding attention despite his simple clothing. His hair was black as a raven's wing, worn long and loose around shoulders that spoke of hard living and harder fighting. But it was his eyes that held Clara transfixed golden like a wolf's, ancient and knowing, burning with an inner fire that seemed to see straight through to her soul. He was Apache. That much was clear from his features and bearing, but he dressed like a man caught between two worlds. He wore buckskin pants and moccasins that made no sound on the wooden sidewalk, but also a white cotton shirt and a black vest that wouldn't have looked out of place on any cowboy. A rifle hung across his back and a bone-handled knife rode at his hip, but Clara noticed that his hands remained relaxed at his sides, showing no immediate threat. Garrison's face darkened like a thundercloud, his pale eyes narrow into slits. "Well, I'll be damned. If it ain't the famous Joaquin Lobo, come down from the mountains to play civilized man." The rancher's voice dripped with contempt and something else, fear, carefully hidden but unmistakably there. "What brings you to our little town, breed? Looking for another scalp to add to your collection?" The Apache Joaquin Lobo, Garrison had called him, stepped into the street with movements so fluid, they seemed to flow like water. Clara found herself studying his face, noting the high cheekbones and strong jaw, the thin scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, the way his golden eyes never wavered from Garrison's face. "I came for supplies," Joaquin said, his voice carrying the faint accent of a man who'd learned English as a second language. "But it seems I've found something more interesting." His gaze flicked to Clara for just a moment, and she felt something. Electric passed between them, a recognition that went deeper than mere attraction. "This girl, she belongs to you?" Garrison's chest puffed out with pride and possessiveness. "Damn right she does. Fair and square, all legal and proper. Her stepfather owed me money he couldn't pay, so we worked out an arrangement." He gestured toward Hartwell, who had finally emerged from the house looking like death warmed over. "Ain't that right, Silas?" Hartwell couldn't meet anyone's eyes, his gaze fixed on the ground as he nodded miserably. "That's right, Mr. Garrison, all legal. And proper, just like you said." Joaquin studied the tableau before him, the cowering stepfather, the triumphant rancher, the girl standing straight and proud despite the terror in her eyes. Clara found herself holding her breath, waiting for his next words, sensing somehow that her entire future hung in the balance. "Interesting," Joaquin said finally, his voice thoughtful. "In my people's way, a man who sells his family to pay gambling debts is considered lower than a snake. We have a word for such men. We call them eaters of their own young." His golden eyes fixed on Hartwell with such contempt that the man actually took a step backward. "But perhaps white man's law is different." "White man's law is the only law that matters in this territory." Garrison snapped, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his pistol. "And that law says the girl is mine. So why don't you just move along, Breed, before this gets unpleasant?" Several of Garrison's men shifted in their saddles, their own hands moving toward their weapons. The morning air grew thick with tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Clara could feel the violence brewing around her, could see the deadly calculation in Joaquin's eyes as he assessed the odds. "I have a different proposal," Joaquin said calmly, apparently unbothered by the dozen guns pointed in his direction. "A challenge, if you will. Your people value strength, yes? Combat? Let us settle this the old way, single combat between you and me. If you win, you keep the girl. If I win—" He paused, his golden eyes finding Clara's face. "She comes with me." Garrison's laugh was ugly and contemptuous. "You want to fight me for her? A breed against a white man? Boy, you must have taken one too many blows to the head." But even as he spoke, Clara could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Joaquin Lobo was clearly not a man to be underestimated. And Garrison hadn't lived this long by taking unnecessary risks. "Afraid?" Joaquin asked quietly, and the single word hung in the air like a challenge thrown down. The question hit Garrison like a slap across the face. In front of his men, in front of the townspeople, in front of the girl he claimed to own, he'd been called a coward by an Apache warrior. His face flushed red with rage and humiliation, and Clara saw his hand tighten on his gun. "You son of a bitch," he snarled, taking a step forward. Nobody calls Brock Garrison afraid. Nobody. He looked around at his watching men, at the townspeople gathered to witness his shame, and Clara saw the exact moment when his pride overcame his caution. "You want to fight, Breed? You got one. But when I'm done with you, I'm gonna hang your scalp from my saddle horn." Joaquin smiled, and it was like watching a wolf bare its teeth. "Then let us begin." The two men faced each other in the middle of the dusty street, as different as night and day, but equally dangerous. Garrison was larger and heavier, his bulk giving him an advantage in pure strength, but Joaquin moved with the liquid grace of a born hunter, every muscle coiled and ready to strike. They circled each other slowly, each man taking the measure of his opponent. Garrison drew his pistol first, a heavy Colt .45 that gleamed in the morning sunlight, but Joaquin was faster. His own weapon, a modified Winchester rifle that he somehow made seem as light as a feather, appeared. in his hands with supernatural speed. The two shots came so close together, they sounded like one. Garrison's bullet took a piece of bark off the hitching post behind Joaquin's head, but the Apache's shot was true. The rancher's gun went flying from his hand, taking 2 fingers with it, and he screamed in pain and rage as blood began to flow. But Joaquin wasn't finished. He tossed his rifle aside and drew his bone-handled knife, advancing on the wounded rancher with the deliberate pace of a predator closing in for the kill. Garrison, cradling his mangled hand against his chest, fumbled for the backup pistol in his boot, but Clara saw that he was too slow, too clumsy with pain and shock. "Wait," she called out, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. Both men turned to look at her, and she realized that she held their lives in her hands. If she said nothing, Joaquin would kill Garrison where he stood, and while the rancher deserved no mercy, she wasn't sure she could live with watching the man die for her sake. "Let him live," she said quietly, her green eyes meeting Joaquin's golden ones. "He's beaten. Let that be enough." Joaquin studied her face for a long moment, reading something there that made him nod slowly. He sheathed his knife and stepped back, but his voice carried clearly across the silent street. "You heard the lady, Garrison. She has shown you mercy. You do not deserve." His golden eyes swept over the rancher's men, who sat their horses in stunned silence. "Take your wounded boss and ride out. If I see any of you in this town again, I won't be so generous." Snake Morrison spurred his horse forward and helped the groaning Garrison mount his black stallion, the rancher's face gray with pain and humiliation. As they prepared to leave, Garrison managed to fix Clara with a stare full of poison and promise. "This ain't over, girl," he gasped through gritted teeth. "I got friends, contacts. You can't hide from me forever." "She won't have to, Joaquin," said quietly, moving to stand beside Clara with unconscious protection. "She's under my protection now." As Garrison and his men rode out of Perdition Creek in defeat, Clara turned to face her unexpected savior. Up close, she could see the intelligence in those golden eyes, the strength in his weathered hands, the way he held himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd never backed down from a fight. "Who are you?" she asked softly, though part of her felt she already knew the answer. "Joaquin Lobo," he replied, his voice gentle now that the danger had passed. "Some call me the Apache Hunter, though I prefer my given name." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "And you are Clara Bell, the girl with fire in her hair and steel in her spine." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that went beyond mere attraction or gratitude. Clara felt as if she'd been waiting her entire life for this man to appear, this warrior who'd materialized from the desert shadows to claim her not as property, but as something infinitely more precious. "Why?" she asked, the question encompassing everything: why he'd intervened, why he'd risked his life, why he looked at her as if she were a miracle instead of a burden. Joaquin's scarred face softened, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "Because the moment I saw you standing there, unbroken despite everything they'd done to you, I knew you were mine. Not to own, Clara Bell, but to protect, to cherish, to love if you'll let me." The desert wind swirled around them, carrying with it the promise of a new beginning and the first whisper of a love that would reshape both their worlds. The Apache camp lay hidden in a canyon 20 miles north of Perdition Creek, its red rock walls rising like ancient guardians against the desert sky. Clara Bell had never imagined such a place could exist, a secret world carved from stone and shadow, where her footsteps echoed off walls painted with centuries of wind and rain. The journey here had taken 3 days on horseback, riding behind Joaquin Lobo, through terrain that seemed impassable until he revealed hidden trails known only to his people. Now, as she stood at the edge of the camp watching Apache women tend cooking fires and children play among the rocks, Clara felt the weight of being the only white person for hundreds of miles. The sensation was both terrifying and oddly liberating. For the first time in her life, she was truly free from the expectations and judgments of her own kind. Joaquin had ridden ahead to speak with the tribal elders, leaving Clara in the care of an elderly woman named Ayana, whose name meant eternal blossom in the Apache tongue. Despite the language barrier, the old woman had shown Clara nothing but kindness, offering her clean clothes and a meal of roasted venison and wild herbs that tasted better than anything she'd eaten in months. "You are afraid," Ayana said in careful English, settling beside Clara on a blanket near the fire. Her weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen much suffering, but had not let it destroy her capacity for compassion. "This is natural. You are far from your people, in a place your kind call savage." Clara looked around the camp, taking in the sight of families gathered around cooking fires, children learning to shoot small bows, young men tending to horses with obvious love and respect. "It doesn't seem savage to me," she said quietly. "It seems truthful, more peaceful than any place I've ever lived." Ayana smiled, her dark eyes crinkling with warmth. "Joaquin said you had wisdom beyond your years. He spoke truly." She stirred the coals with a long stick, sending sparks dancing into the darkening sky. "But you wonder why he brought you here, yes? Why he risked much to claim you from the evil one?" The question Clara had been afraid to ask hung between them, like smoke from the fire. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "There is much you do not know about Joaquin Lobo," Ayana continued, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "Much he has not told you because the pain is still fresh, even after 3 winters have passed." Clara found herself leaning forward, drawn by something in the old woman's tone that spoke of secrets and sorrows long carried. "He was not always called Lobo Wolf," Ayana began. "His birth name was Nalnish, which means he works, but names change when the heart changes, and his heart was broken in ways that seemed beyond healing." The fire crackled and popped, filling the silence as Ayana gathered her thoughts. In the distance, Clara could hear the soft sound of Apache voices speaking in their native tongue, the occasional laugh of a child, the gentle nickering of horses. "3 winters ago, Joaquin took a wife," Ayana continued. "A girl from the Chiricahua band named Itzel. She was beautiful as the morning star, with a spirit that could not be tamed. They loved each other with the passion of young hearts, and for a time, it seemed the world was full of nothing but joy." Clara felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, followed immediately by shame. Of course a man like Joaquin would have loved before, would have given his heart to someone who shared his blood, his culture, his understanding of the world. What happened to her? Clara asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Ayana's expression darkened, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old grief. Brock Garrison happened to her. The name hit Clara like a physical blow. She should have known, should have guessed that the evil that had touched her life would have touched Joaquin's as well. Garrison killed her? Worse, Ayana said, and the single word contained universes of pain. He took her, stole her from our camp during a trading expedition to the border settlements. Joaquin was away, hunting with the men, and when he returned, she shook her head, unable to continue for a moment. Clara felt her heart breaking for this man who had saved her, understanding now the haunted look she sometimes saw in his golden eyes. He went after her. Of course he did. He was her husband, her protector. He tracked Garrison to his ranch, but by the time he arrived, Ayana's voice trailed off, and she stared into the fire as if seeing the past play out in the flames. Itzel had chosen death over dishonor. She threw herself from the highest window of Garrison's house rather than submit to him. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of tragedy. Clara found herself thinking of how close she had come to sharing Itzel's fate, how differently things might have gone if Joaquin hadn't appeared when he did. Joaquin found her body, Ayana continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He buried her in the old way, high on a mountain where the wind could carry her spirit to the ancestors. Then he disappeared into the desert for 6 moons, and when he returned, he was changed. No longer Nalnish the worker, but Lobo, the wolf, solitary, dangerous, living for nothing but revenge. Clara began to understand the depth of what Joaquin had done for her, the significance of his intervention. He had seen in her situation an echo of his own tragedy, a chance to save someone he couldn't save before. "But why me?" she asked. "I'm not Apache. I'm not even particularly brave or strong. I'm just a girl whose stepfather gambled her away." Ayana studied Clara's face in the firelight, seeing something there that made her smile. "You are wrong about yourself, child. Joaquin sees what others do not. He sees the warrior spirit that burned in you even when you stood alone against evil. You did not bow to Garrison, did not beg or plead or try to bargain with your dignity. You stood straight and faced him with courage." Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made both women look up. Joaquin emerged from the shadows, his face grave with whatever news he'd received from the tribal council. He moved with his usual fluid grace, but Clara noticed a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Ayana, grandmother," he said, using the respectful term for the elderly woman, "would you leave us to speak alone?" The old woman rose with surprising agility and patted Clara's hand gently. "Remember what I have told you, child. Some things are worth more than safety." With that cryptic comment, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving Clara alone with the man who had turned her world upside down. Joaquin settled beside her on the blanket, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. "Ayana told you about Itzel," he said finally, and it wasn't a question. Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She wanted to offer comfort, to say something that would ease the pain she could see etched in the lines of his face, but she couldn't find words adequate to the magnitude of his loss. "I need you to understand something," Joaquin continued, his voice carefully controlled. "When I saw you standing there, refusing to bow to Garrison, I saw her. Not her face, yours is different, beautiful in its own way, but her spirit. The same fire, the same refusal to be broken." He turned to face her fully, his golden eyes intense in the firelight. "I did not save you to replace her, Clarabelle. No one could do that. I saved you because something in my heart recognized something in yours, and I could not let Garrison destroy another woman's light." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the raw honesty in his voice. "What did the council say?" she asked, changing the subject to give him space to breathe. Joaquin's expression darkened. "Garrison has been busy since his defeat. He's contacted the territorial governor, claimed that I kidnapped you from lawful custody. There's a bounty on my head now, $500, dead or alive." The amount was staggering, more money than most people in the territory would see in 5 years. Clara felt a chill of fear run down her spine as she realized what this meant. "He's also hired additional men," Joaquin continued. "Bounty hunters, mercenaries, anyone willing to track an Apache through the desert for the right price. Some of them are very good at what they do." Clara's mind raced through the implications. "So we're trapped here? Hiding in this canyon while he builds an army against us?" "We could stay," Joaquin said carefully. "My people would protect you, give you a place among us. You could learn our ways, become one of us in truth." The offer was tempting in its simplicity. Clara could imagine herself growing old in this hidden canyon, learning to weave baskets and cure hides, perhaps even finding a measure of peace. But something in Joaquin's tone told her there was more to consider. "But," she prompted, "but Garrison will never stop hunting us. As long as he lives, you will never be safe. Nor will any other woman who catches his eye." Joaquin picked up a small stone and tossed it into the fire, watching the sparks fly. He has tasted defeat now, and it has made him desperate. Desperate. Men do desperate things. Clara thought about this, weighing her options with the careful consideration her mother had taught her to apply to all important decisions. What do you propose? Joaquin was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he'd heard her question. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had thought long and hard about what he was going to say. There is another way. A more dangerous way, but one that could end this permanently. He met her eyes, and she saw something there that made her heart race, not fear, but anticipation. We could go back. Face him on his own ground, with his own weapons. You mean the law, Clara said, understanding immediately. Use the territorial. Courts against him. More than that. I have friends among the Apache scouts who work with the cavalry. Men who have seen Garrison's operation firsthand. Who know about the women who disappear, the workers who are never paid, the tribal members who go missing after dealing with him. Joaquin's voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if the very act of planning was giving him strength. With the right evidence, the right witnesses, we could destroy him completely. Clara felt a surge of excitement mixed with terror. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. It would mean leaving the safety of this place, putting ourselves at risk. Yes, Joaquin agreed. It would mean that. But it would also mean that other women, Apache women, Mexican women, white women would not have to face what you faced. What Itzel faced. The choice, when it came down to it, was really no choice at all. Clara had spent her entire life watching stronger people prey on weaker ones, had seen her mother work herself to death, trying to satisfy a man who would never be satisfied. She had been raised to believe that a woman's role was to endure, to survive, to make the best of whatever circumstances men created for her. But sitting here in this firelight, with a man who had risked everything to save her, Clara Bell felt something new stirring in her chest. Not the desire to endure, but the desire to fight. Not the hope of survival, but the dream of victory. When do we leave? She asked, and was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Joaquin smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Gone was the haunted warrior, replaced by a man who had found something worth fighting for beyond revenge. Tomorrow night. There's a town called Mesa Grande, 3 days' ride south. The territorial judge holds court there once a month, and he's one of the few men in this territory who can't be bought. Clara nodded, feeling a strange sense of destiny settling over her like a mantle. What about your people? Won't they try to stop you? They understand, Joaquin said simply. A warrior must follow his path, even when it leads away from safety. Especially then. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara found herself studying Joaquin's profile in the firelight, memorizing the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his shoulders, the calloused hands that had saved her life. Tomorrow they would leave this place of peace and ride toward danger. But tonight, Joaquin, she said softly, and he turned to look at her. When you said I was yours, back in Perdition Creek, ... what did you mean? His golden eyes held hers. And she saw the depth of feeling there, carefully controlled, but unmistakably present. I meant that from the moment I saw you, I knew my heart had found its other half. Not to possess, but to cherish. Not to control, but to protect. He reached out and touched her cheek with infinite gentleness. But only if that's what you want, Clara Bell. The choice is always yours. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she leaned into his touch. She had never been courted, never been kissed, never been anything but a burden to be disposed of. But here, in the firelight of an Apache camp, with a warrior who had killed for her and would die for her, she felt beautiful, wanted, worthy of love. I want to choose you, she whispered, and saw the way his eyes flared with emotion. If you'll have me. His answer came not in words but in the gentle pressure of his lips against hers. A kiss that tasted of smoke and starlight and the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined just days before. When they finally broke apart, Clara felt as if the world had shifted on its axis, as if everything that had come before had been leading to this moment. Tomorrow they would ride toward danger, toward a confrontation that could end in death for both of them. But tonight, in the warmth of the fire and the circle of each other's arms, Clara Belle finally understood what it meant to be free. Mesa Grande sprawled across the valley floor like a fever dream, its adobe buildings baking in the merciless Arizona sun while dust devils danced between the scattered structures. The town existed for one purpose: to serve as the territorial courthouse for 3 counties worth of disputes, crimes, and legal proceedings that couldn't be settled with bullets alone. Once a month, Judge Elias Thornfield arrived on the stage from Phoenix, bringing with him the full weight of territorial law and a reputation for honesty that had survived 20 years on the frontier. Clara Belle sat astride the Pinto Mare Joaquin had given her, watching the town through a brass spyglass while he studied the terrain with the calculating eye of a born strategist. They had camped in the hills above Mesa Grande for 2 days, observing the rhythms of the settlement and waiting for the judge's arrival. What they had seen during those hours of surveillance had chilled Clara's blood and hardened her resolve. In equal measure. "There," Joaquin said quietly, pointing toward a large encampment on the eastern edge of town. "Garrison's brought half an army with him." Clara adjusted the spyglass and counted at least 30 men scattered around the campsite bounty. Hunters, mercenaries, and hired guns from across the territory. She recognized some of them from wanted posters. Black Jack Ketchum with his distinctive eye patch, the Dalton brothers who'd terrorized Kansas before fleeing west, and most frighteningly, Ezra Bone, the Cherokee tracker who could follow a trail across solid rock and had never failed to bring in his quarry, dead or alive. "He's not taking any chances," Clara murmured, lowering the spyglass. "That's enough firepower to take on a cavalry regiment." "Desperate men make desperate choices," Joaquin replied, but his voice carried concern. "Garrison knows this is his last chance to reclaim you legally. If Judge Thornfield rules against him, he'll have to resort to more direct methods." Clara studied her companion's profile, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hand unconsciously moved to check his weapons. Over the past week, she had come to read the subtle signs of his moods, the slight tightening around his eyes when he was calculating odds, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture when danger approached. Right now, every instinct he possessed was screaming warnings. "You think it's a trap," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I know it's a trap. The question is whether we're walking into it with our eyes open or our eyes closed." Joaquin turned to face her fully, his golden eyes serious. "There's still time to turn back, Clara. We could disappear into Mexico or up into Colorado territory. Start fresh somewhere Garrison's influence doesn't reach." The offer was tempting, and Clara found herself seriously considering it for a long moment. Life on the run with Joaquin wouldn't be easy, but it would be life something she'd thought she'd lost forever when Silas Hartwell threw those cards down on the saloon table. But as she looked down at Mesa Grande, at the camp full of killers hired to hunt them, at the courthouse where justice waited like a double-edged sword, she felt the fire her mother had passed down to her burn brighter. "No," she said firmly. "Running means other women will face what I faced. What Itzel faced. We end this here, or we die trying." Joaquin studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we go in tonight. Before dawn, when Garrison's men are sleeping off. Their whiskey in the town is quiet." As if summoned by their conversation, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed up from the valley floor. A small group of riders was approaching Mesa Grande from the south. Judge Thornfield's entourage, arriving right on schedule. Clara watched through the spyglass as the dignified older man dismounted from his horse and was immediately surrounded by townspeople seeking his attention. But she also noticed something else that made her blood run cold. Among the crowd greeting, the judge was a familiar figure, Silas Hartwell, her stepfather, looking cleaner and better dressed than she'd seen him in years. Garrison's money had apparently bought him new clothes and a shave, though it couldn't wash the guilt from his haunted eyes. "He brought Silas," Clara said, her voice tight with anger. "The bastard brought my stepfather as a witness." Joaquin took the spyglass and confirmed what she'd seen. "It makes sense from a legal standpoint," he said grimly. "Silas can testify that he signed the contract willingly, that everything was done according to territorial law. Without evidence of coercion or fraud, the judge might be forced to uphold Garrison's claim." Clara felt her carefully constructed plan crumbling around her. They had counted on the testimonies of Apache scouts and the few brave souls willing to speak against Garrison, but those accounts might not carry as much weight as the word of Clara's own legal guardian. In the eyes of the law, Silas Hartwell had every right to dispose of his stepdaughter as he saw fit. "Then we need something more," Clara said, her mind racing. "Something that proves Garrison's contract was illegal from the start." "What do you mean?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the implications of what she was about to suggest. "The territorial government has been cracking down on human trafficking, hasn't it? Especially after that scandal in Tucson last year?" Joaquin confirmed this with a nod. The territorial legislature had passed strict laws against the buying and selling of human beings, largely in response to pressure from Washington to clean up the frontier's image before statehood could be considered. "What if we could prove that Garrison has been doing this systematically? Not just taking me to settle a debt, but actually running a slave trade operation?" Clara's voice grew stronger as the plan took shape. "He's got to keep records somewhere, bills of sale, shipping manifests, correspondence with buyers. If we could get our hands on those documents, it would destroy him completely," Joaquin finished, understanding immediately. "But getting into his ranch to find evidence like that would be suicide. The place is a fortress, and after what happened in Perdition Creek, he'll have it guarded like Fort Knox." Clara smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. That would have made Brock Garrison very nervous if he'd seen it. Not his ranch, his hotel room here in Mesa Grande. The plan that emerged over the next several hours was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Garrison would be staying at the Grand Mesa Hotel, the finest accommodation in town, while he waited for his legal proceedings. As a man of business, he would certainly have brought documents with him, contracts, correspondence, financial records that could prove his systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. Clara would pose as a serving girl and gain access to his room while Joaquin created a distraction that would draw away the guards. They would photograph any incriminating evidence using a small camera Joaquin had acquired from a traveling photographer, then escape before anyone realized what had happened. It was, they both admitted, probably a suicide mission. But it was also their only chance to turn the legal proceedings in their favor. As the sun set over Mesa Grande, painting the desert sky in shades of crimson and gold, Clara dressed in the simple clothing of a hotel servant, a white blouse, dark skirt, and apron that Joaquin had somehow managed to acquire. She braided her distinctive red hair and pinned it up beneath a white cap, transforming herself from the notorious Apache captive into just another anonymous working girl. "Remember," Joaquin said as he helped her adjust the disguise, "get in, find what we need, and get out. Don't try to be a hero if something goes wrong." Clara nodded, though they both knew that if their plan was discovered, there would be no escape for either of them. Garrison's men would shoot first and ask questions later, and even Judge Thornfield's presence wouldn't protect them from a lynch mob, convinced they were dealing with dangerous criminals. The Grand Mesa Hotel was a 3-story monument to frontier prosperity, its gas-lit windows casting warm rectangles of light onto the dusty street below. Clara approached the service entrance with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. Slipping inside during the controlled chaos of dinner service, the kitchen was a symphony of organized madness, cooks shouting orders, servers rushing back and forth with loaded trays, and enough noise to mask the sound of one additional person moving through the confusion. Clara grabbed an empty tray and merged seamlessly with the flow of workers, making her way up the back stairs toward the guest rooms. Garrison had taken the hotel's finest suite on the 3rd floor, and Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the door. 2 of his men stood guard in the hallway, not the dangerous professionals from his camp, but local toughs who'd been hired for the evening. They barely glanced at her as she knocked softly and called out in the Spanish accent she'd practiced, "Room service center. Compliments of the management." The door opened to reveal Brock Garrison himself, looking more prosperous and dangerous than ever in his expensive suit and freshly waxed mustache. His pale blue eyes fixed on Clara's face with the predatory interest of a man who'd never learned to control his appetites. "Well, well," he drawled, stepping aside to let her enter. "Aren't you a pretty little thing? What's your name, darling?" "Maria." "Center," Clara replied, keeping her eyes downcast as she set the tray on the room's ornate table. "I bring you the finest meal the hotel has to offer." Garrison moved closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruel satisfaction in his eyes. "Maria, that's a lovely name for a lovely girl." His hand moved to touch her face, and Clara had to fight every instinct to recoil from his touch. "You know, I might have some additional work for a girl like you. Private work, very well paid." Through sheer force of will, Clara managed to smile and nod while her skin crawled at his proximity. "See, Center, whatever you need." But even as she played her role, her eyes were cataloging the contents of the room. Garrison's saddlebags lay open on the bed, papers spilling out in casual disorder. A leather portfolio sat on the writing desk, thick with documents that could be exactly what they needed. Most importantly, she could see the corner of what looked like a ledger book protruding from beneath a stack of legal papers. Garrison's attention was entirely focused on her now, his hands moving to her shoulders with the confidence of a man who'd never been refused. "You're much prettier than the usual girls they send up here. Younger, too. I like that in a woman." Clara bit back the revulsion rising in her throat and forced herself to lean into his touch. "You are very kind, Center. Very generous." "Oh, I can be very generous indeed," Garrison murmured, his breath hot against her ear. "Especially to girls who know how to please a man properly." It was then that the explosion shattered the evening calm. The blast came from somewhere near the hotel's stables, close enough to rattle the windows and send plaster dust drifting from the ceiling. Garrison jerked away from Clara, his business instincts overriding his baser desires as shouts and screams rose from the street below. "What the hell?" he began, moving toward the window to investigate. In that moment of distraction, Clara struck like a snake. She grabbed the ledger book from the desk and shoved it beneath her apron, then snatched several loose documents from the saddlebags. The camera hidden in her sleeve came out next, and she quickly photographed the pages of correspondence that remained on the bed. Outside, she could hear Garrison's guards running toward the source of the explosion, their heavy boots thundering down the hallway. Whatever Joaquin had done to create his distraction, it was working perfectly. But as Clara prepared to make her escape, Garrison turned back from the window and his eyes immediately fixed on the disturbed papers. His face went white with rage as he realized what had happened. "You little bitch," he snarled, lunging toward her. "Who sent you? Who are you working for?" Clara dodged his grasping hands and bolted for the door, but Garrison was faster than his bulk suggested. His fingers caught the edge of her apron, jerking her backward with enough force to send her stumbling. The ledger book tumbled to the floor, its pages scattering like autumn leaves. Well, Garrison said, his voice deadly calm now that his initial rage had passed. "Look what we have here. Industrial espionage, theft, breaking and entering. That's enough to hang you, little girl." Clara backed toward the window, her mind racing through options that all seemed to end in death or capture. The drop to the street was 3 stories, survivable if she was lucky, fatal if she wasn't. But staying meant facing Garrison's tender mercies, and she'd already decided she'd rather die than submit to him. "Don't even think about it," Garrison warned, reading her intentions. "That fall will kill you, and I need you alive. You're going to tell me who you're working with, and then you're going to pay for what you've cost me." But Clara Bell had not survived everything she'd endured to surrender now. With her mother's determination burning in her heart and Joaquin's love giving her strength, she grabbed the heaviest object within reach, a crystal whiskey decanter, and hurled it at Garrison's head with all her strength. The crystal exploded against his skull in a shower of glass and aged bourbon, sending the rancher crashing to the floor with blood streaming down his face. Clara didn't wait to see if he was unconscious or merely stunned. She gathered the scattered ledger pages and dove through the window into the night, trusting to fate and Joaquin's love to see her through what came next. The fall seemed to last forever, the ground rushing up to meet her with terrifying speed. But instead of hard-packed earth, she landed in the canvas roof of a supply wagon, the material tearing but slowing her descent enough to save her life. She rolled off the wagon and onto the street, bruised and shaken, but miraculously unbroken. Above her, Garrison's roar of rage echoed from the hotel window, followed by his bellowed orders to his men. Within moments, the street would be swarming with armed killers hunting for one red-haired girl, with a fortune in evidence hidden beneath her torn apron. Clara Bell ran into the night, clutching the proof of Brock Garrison's crimes against her chest, knowing that tomorrow would bring either justice or death, and for the first time in her life, finding herself ready for either. Judge Elias Thornfield's gavel echoed through the packed courthouse like a gunshot, bringing an uneasy silence to the most volatile gathering Mesa Grande had ever witnessed. The territorial courthouse, built to accommodate perhaps 50 spectators, now held twice that number, with armed men from both sides eyeing each other like wolves preparing for battle. The morning sun slanted through tall windows, casting harsh shadows across faces etched with tension, greed, and barely contained violence. Clara Bell sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, acutely aware that every eye in the room was fixed upon her. The past 12 hours had been a blur of desperate preparation, treating her injuries from the hotel escape, organizing the stolen evidence with Joaquin's help, and somehow managing to convince Judge Thornfield's clerk to add their case to the morning docket. Despite Garrison's obvious influence, she looked nothing like the terrified girl who had been bartered away in a Perdition Creek saloon barely 2 weeks ago. Her red hair was pinned back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her green eyes, and she wore the only respectable dress she owned, her mother's Sunday best, altered to fit her smaller frame. But it was more than her appearance. That had changed. Clara Bell carried herself now with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the devil himself and lived to tell the tale. Beside her, Joaquin Lobo sat motionless as carved stone, his golden eyes never leaving Brock Garrison's face. The Apache warrior had exchanged his usual buckskins for a dark suit that made him look civilized but no less dangerous. A casual observer might think he was relaxed, but Clara could see the tension coiled in his shoulders, the way his hand rested near the knife at his belt, despite the courthouse's prohibition on weapons. Across the aisle, Garrison held court like a frontier king, surrounded by his army of hired guns and legal advisors. The rancher bore the evidence of their previous night's encounter, a white bandage wrapped around his head, where Clara's crystal decanter had found its mark, and his pale blue eyes burning with a hatred that promised terrible retribution. His expensive suit couldn't hide the brutal reality of what he was, but it might be enough to convince a territorial judge that he represented civilization and order. Behind Garrison sat Silas Hartwell, looking like a man attending his own funeral. Clara's stepfather had aged years in the past 2 weeks, his face gaunt and his hands shaking with what might have been guilt or simple fear. When their eyes met briefly across the crowded courtroom, he looked away immediately, unable to bear the weight of what he'd done to the daughter of the woman he'd claimed to love. Judge Thornfield himself was an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of penetrating stare that could see through lies and legal maneuvering to the truth beneath. He'd spent 20 years bringing law to the lawless territories, and his reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for corruption. If there was any man in Arizona territory who couldn't be bought, bribed, or intimidated, it was Elias Thornfield. "This court is now in session," the judge announced, his voice carrying easily through the packed room. "We are here to adjudicate the matter of Garrison versus Bell, regarding the legal status of one Clara Bell and the validity of certain contractual obligations. Mr. Garrison, as the plaintiff in this matter, you may present your case first." Garrison's lawyer, a slick-talking man named Cornelius Blackwood, who'd been imported from San Francisco specifically for this case, rose with theatrical flourish. Everything about Blackwood screamed expensive, from his perfectly tailored suit to his gold watch chained to the confidence of a man who'd never lost a case he couldn't afford to lose. "Your Honor," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the smooth authority of practiced oratory, "this case is remarkably simple, despite the attempts by certain parties to complicate it with irrelevant emotionalism. My client, Mr. Brock Garrison, entered into a lawful contract with Mr. Silas Hartwell for the satisfaction of a legitimate debt. The terms were clearly stated, willingly agreed upon by both parties, and properly witnessed according to territorial statute." Blackwood produced the promissory note with a flourish, holding it up for the judge and jury to see. "This document, signed by Mr. Hartwell's own hand, clearly states that in the event of default on his gambling obligations, my client would be entitled to compensation in whatever form he deemed appropriate. Mr. Hartwell chose to offer his stepdaughter's services as settlement, and my client graciously accepted this arrangement." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this clinical description of Clara's sale, but Judge Thornfield's sharp gaze quickly restored order. "Furthermore," Blackwood continued, warming to his theme, "Miss Bell was subsequently taken from my client's lawful custody by force, threatened with violence, and hidden away in violation of a legally binding agreement. We are not here today to debate the morality of Mr. Hartwell's decision. Territorial law clearly establishes a guardian's right to dispose of his ward's services as he sees fit. We are here to determine whether contracts will be honored, or whether violence and intimidation will be allowed to triumph over law and order." Clara felt her blood boil at the lawyer's smooth words, the way he reduced her life to mere legal technicalities and commercial transactions. But she forced herself to remain calm, knowing that their entire case depended on presenting the evidence they'd risked their lives to obtain. Blackwood called his first witness Silas Hartwell himself, who shuffled to the witness stand like a man walking to the gallows. Under Blackwood's gentle questioning, Hartwell confirmed that he had willingly entered into the agreement with Garrison, that he understood the terms, and that Clara had been legally his ward at the time the contract was signed. "Mr. Hartwell," Blackwood said with false sympathy, "I know this must be difficult for you, but I must ask, did anyone force you to sign this agreement? Were you threatened or coerced in any way?" Hartwell's eyes found Clara's face across the courtroom, and for a moment she saw something like remorse flicker there. But fear won out over conscience, as it always had with him. "No," he whispered, so quietly the judge had to ask him to repeat himself. "No, nobody forced me. I signed it of my own free will." The next witness was Snake Morrison, who testified about finding Clara at an Apache camp, living in sin with a half-breed warrior, and confirming that she had been taken from Garrison's custody by force. His testimony was designed to paint her as a willing participant in her own rescue, making her seem less like a victim and more like a runaway, who'd simply chosen one man over another. But it was Garrison himself who provided the most compelling testimony for his case. Taking the stand with the confident bearing of a successful businessman, he painted himself as the victim of an elaborate conspiracy designed to cheat him out of his lawful property. "Your Honor," Garrison said, his voice carrying just the right note of wounded dignity, "I am not an unreasonable man. When Mr. Hartwell came to me with his proposition, I was initially hesitant to accept. Taking responsibility for a young woman is a serious matter not to be undertaken lightly. But I saw it as an opportunity to provide guidance and security for someone who had few other options in life." Clara had to grip the edge of her seat to keep from leaping up and screaming at the lies pouring from Garrison's mouth. The man who had terrorized her, who had murdered Joaquin's wife, who had built his fortune on the suffering of countless women, was presenting himself as a benevolent guardian seeking only to help an unfortunate girl. Instead, Garrison continued, his voice growing stronger with righteous indignation, "I find myself the victim of theft, assault, and a campaign of character assassination. Miss Bell was taken from my protection by an Apache warrior with a known history of violence against white settlers. She has been living in conditions that no decent Christian woman should endure, and yet somehow I am painted as the villain in this affair." Blackwood had done his work well. By the time Garrison stepped down from the witness stand, Clara could see uncertainty in the faces of several jury members. The law was clearly on Garrison's side, regardless of the moral implications, and without compelling evidence to the contrary, Judge Thornfield might be forced to rule in his favor. But then it was their turn. The court-appointed lawyer representing Clara and Joaquin was a young man named Daniel Crawford, fresh out of law school and green as spring grass. He'd volunteered to take their case when no other attorney in 3 counties would risk Garrison's wrath. And while he lacked experience, he made up for it with passion and a genuine desire to see justice done. "Your Honor," Crawford began, his voice initially shaky but growing stronger as he spoke, "the defense does not dispute that a contract was signed between Mr. Hartwell and Mr. Garrison. What we dispute is the legality of that contract and the true nature of Mr. Garrison's business operations." Crawford's first witness was Captain James Mitchell of the Territorial Cavalry, a weathered veteran who'd spent years fighting Apache raiders and tracking down fugitives. Mitchell testified that he'd had multiple interactions with Garrison over the years, usually involving missing persons reports from tribal reservations and Mexican settlements. "In my experience," Mitchell said bluntly, "Mr. Garrison's ranching operation serves as a front for something much darker. We've had reports of workers who disappear, young women who are promised employment and never seen again, Apache prisoners who are supposed to be released but somehow end up in Garrison's custody instead." Blackwood objected vigorously, claiming the testimony was hearsay and irrelevant to the contract dispute, but Judge Thornfield allowed it to continue. The next witness was Maria Santos, a Mexican woman who'd escaped from Garrison's ranch 6 months earlier. Her testimony, delivered in halting English, supplemented by a Spanish interpreter, painted a horrifying picture of systematic abuse and exploitation. "He kept us locked up," Maria said, tears streaming down her face. "The women, we were not workers, we were prisoners. He would sell us to other ranchers, to mine owners, anyone who would pay his price. Those who tried to escape." She shuddered, unable to continue, but it was the documentary evidence that provided the most damning testimony. Crawford presented the ledger pages and correspondence Clara had stolen from Garrison's hotel room, documents that revealed the true scope of his operations. Bills of sale listing human beings as livestock, shipping manifests detailing the transport of workers to mines and ranches across the territory, correspondence with buyers discussing the quality and breeding potential of various captives. These Documents, Crawford said, holding up the evidence for the jury to see, prove beyond any doubt that Mr. Garrison is engaged in the systematic buying and selling of human beings in direct violation of territorial and federal law. The contract he seeks to enforce is not a legitimate business agreement. It is a bill of sale for a human being, which makes it illegal on its face. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the implications of the evidence sank in. Garrison's men shifted restlessly, hands moving toward weapons that weren't there, while townspeople who'd lived in fear of the rancher for years suddenly saw him in a new light. Judge Thornfield's gavel pounded repeatedly before order was restored. Blackwood tried desperately to discredit the evidence, claiming it had been obtained illegally and might have been forged, but the weight of testimony from multiple witnesses was overwhelming. When Clara herself took the stand to describe her treatment at Garrison's hands, her quiet dignity and obvious sincerity swayed even the most skeptical jury members. Mr. Garrison claimed he wanted to provide me with guidance and security, Clara said, her voice clear and strong despite the tears in her eyes. But what he actually wanted was to add me to his collection of human property. He told me himself that I would be sold to mine owners, that I would work until I died, and that no one would ever look for me because everyone believed I belonged to him. The final witness was Joaquin himself, who described finding Itzel's broken body after Garrison's assault and the years he'd spent tracking the rancher's criminal network. His testimony was delivered in the clipped, precise English of someone speaking a second language, but its impact was devastating. Garrison does not see women as human beings, Joaquin said, his golden eyes boring into the rancher's pale ones. To him, we are all just animals to be bought, sold, used, and discarded. He killed my wife as surely as if he'd put a bullet in her head, and he would have killed Clara Bell too, eventually, when he grew tired of her. By the time all testimony had been heard, the mood in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a simple contract dispute had become something much larger, a trial that would determine whether the law would protect the powerful or defend the vulnerable. Judge Thornfield called for a recess to allow the jury to deliberate, but Clara could see in his face that a decision had already been reached. When court reconvened an hour later, the judge's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. In the matter of Garrison versus Bell, Judge Thornfield announced, this court finds that the contract in question violates Territorial Statute 394, which explicitly prohibits the buying and selling of human beings. Furthermore, the evidence presented demonstrates that Mr. Garrison has engaged in systematic human trafficking in violation of both territorial and federal law. The judge's gavel fell like thunder. The contract is declared null and void. Miss Bell is declared a free citizen of the Arizona Territory, with all rights and protections afforded thereto. Mr. Garrison, you are ordered to surrender yourself to territorial authorities pending formal charges of human trafficking, kidnapping, and conspiracy. But even as the words left the judge's mouth, Clara could see that Garrison had no intention of surrendering to anyone. The rancher's hand was already moving toward the derringer he'd somehow smuggled into the courthouse, his face twisted with rage and desperation. The next few seconds unfolded like a nightmare played out in slow motion. With death stalking through the crowded courtroom and the taste of gunpowder already heavy in the air, the derringer appeared in Brock Garrison's hand like black magic, its silver barrel catching the courthouse's afternoon light as he swung it toward Judge Thornfield's chest. Time seemed to fracture into crystalline moments, the judge's eyes widening in shock, women screaming and diving for cover, men shouting and reaching for weapons that weren't there. In that split second before violence erupted, Clara Bell saw her entire future balanced on the edge of a knife. But Joaquin Lobo had been watching Garrison with the focused intensity of a predator, reading the subtle signs of a desperate man about to make his final play. Even as the derringer cleared Garrison's jacket, the Apache warrior was already moving, his body uncoiling like a striking snake. The bone-handled knife that had never left his side sang through the air with deadly precision, its blade catching Garrison's wrist and sending the small pistol spinning away across the courtroom floor. Garrison howled in pain and rage, clutching his wounded arm while blood seeped between his fingers. His pale blue eyes, wild now with the madness of a cornered animal, swept the packed courtroom until they fixed on Clara with murderous intent. "If I can't have you," he snarled, his voice carrying over the chaos, "then nobody can." He lunged toward her with surprising speed for such a large man, but Clara had learned much during her time with the Apache. Instead of freezing in terror as the old Clara might have done, she rolled sideways off the bench and came up in a crouch, her mother's sewing scissors, the only weapon she'd been able to smuggle into the courthouse, gleaming in her hand. "You want me, Garrison?" she called out, her voice ringing with a confidence that would have made Martha Bell proud. "Then take me, but I won't go easy and I won't go quiet." The confrontation might have ended there, with Garrison bleeding and weaponless, facing a woman who had learned to fight for herself. But the rancher's army of hired guns had not been idle during the trial. While attention focused on the courtroom drama, they had been positioning themselves throughout Mesa Grande, and now they struck with coordinated precision. The courthouse doors burst open as Snake Morrison and his men poured in, guns drawn and murder in their eyes. The peaceful legal proceeding transformed instantly into a war zone, with bullets flying and innocent civilians diving for whatever cover they could find. Judge Thornfield's bailiffs, outnumbered and outgunned, fell back toward the bench while trying to protect the court officials. "This ends now," Morrison shouted over the gunfire, his scarred face twisted with hatred. "The Apache and the girl come with us, or everybody dies." But Morrison had made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that the townspeople of Mesa Grande would cower in terror at the sight of his guns, just as they had in Perdition Creek. What he hadn't counted on was that word of Garrison's crimes had spread through the community like wildfire, and that many of these supposedly peaceful citizens had their own reasons for wanting to see justice done. The first shot came from an unexpected source, Maria Santos, the Mexican woman who'd testified about her captivity at Garrison's ranch. She'd somehow acquired a rifle and positioned herself in the courthouse balcony, and her first bullet took down one of Morrison's men before he even realized the danger. Her cry of "Por todas las mujeres perdidas," for all the lost women, became a rallying cry as other survivors of Garrison's operation emerged from the crowd, with weapons of their own. What followed was unlike any gunfight the territory had ever seen. This wasn't the stereotypical showdown between good guys and bad guys in a dusty street. This was a desperate battle for justice fought by people who had been victimized, terrorized, and silenced for too long. Apache scouts who'd been tracking Garrison's network opened fire from the courthouse windows. Mexican vaqueros whose sisters had disappeared fought alongside cavalry veterans who'd seen too many reports go uninvestigated. Even some of the townspeople, who'd previously been too afraid to speak against Garrison, now found their courage in the face of his ultimate betrayal of civilized law. In the midst of this chaos, Clara found herself separated from Joaquin, pinned down behind an overturned table while bullets splintered the wood above her head. She could see him across the courtroom, methodically working his way through Morrison's men with the deadly efficiency of someone who'd learned warfare from Apache masters. But between them stood Garrison himself, wounded but far from defeated, using the confusion to advance on her position. "You cost me everything," Garrison screamed, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "My ranch, my business, my reputation, all because one little girl couldn't accept her place in the world." Clara raised the scissors in her hand, knowing they would be pathetically inadequate against Garrison's size and strength, but determined to make him pay dearly for whatever he planned to do to her. "My place isn't whatever you decide it is," she replied with steel in her voice. My place is wherever I choose to make it." Garrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with madness. "Your choice? Girl, you've never had a choice in your life. Your mama didn't choose to die young. Your stepfather didn't choose to be a drunk and a gambler, and you don't get to choose what happens next." He reached for her with hands that had destroyed so many lives, but Clara had one more surprise in store. The sewing scissors might have been small, but they were sharp, and she'd learned precision from watching Joaquin work with his knives. Her strike was aimed not at Garrison's heart or throat, but at the tendon in his wrist, a disabling cut that would rob him of the strength to hurt anyone ever again. Garrison's howl of pain and rage was cut short as Joaquin appeared behind him. Like an avenging spirit, the Apache warrior's strong arms wrapped around the rancher's neck in a chokehold that promised unconsciousness or death, depending on how much resistance Garrison offered. "It's over," Joaquin said quietly, his voice somehow carrying clearly through the diminishing gunfire. "Your men are dead or surrendered, your empire is destroyed, and your crimes are known to the world. Yield now, and you might live to see a federal prison." But Garrison had one final card to play. With his remaining functional hand, he pulled the pin from a small black powder grenade, the kind used by miners to blast through rock, and entirely illegal to possess within town limits. His smile was that of a man who decided that if he couldn't win, nobody would. "If I'm going to hell," he gasped through Joaquin's chokehold, "I'm taking all of you with me." The next few seconds stretched into eternity. Clara saw the smoking grenade fall from Garrison's nerveless fingers, saw Joaquin's eyes widen with understanding, saw the few remaining people in the courtroom scramble desperately for the exits. There wasn't time to run, wasn't time to take cover, wasn't even time to say goodbye to the man who'd given her back her life. But sometimes, miracles come wrapped in the most unlikely packages. Judge Elias Thornfield, that symbol of law and order on the frontier, proved that he hadn't always been a man of books and legal precedents. With the reflexes of someone who'd spent his youth dodging bullets and Indian arrows, the silver-haired judge scooped up the grenade and hurled it through the courthouse's large front window in a perfect arc that carried it safely away from the building. The explosion, when it came, shattered every window in Mesa Grande and brought down part of the courthouse's front wall. But it claimed no lives except those of 3 of Morrison's men who'd been caught in the open street. And when the dust and smoke finally cleared, Brock Garrison lay unconscious in Joaquin's arms, while Clara Bell stood triumphant among the ruins of what had once seemed like an impossible fight. The aftermath of the Battle of Mesa Grande, as it came to be known in territorial history, unfolded with surprising speed. Federal marshals arrived within days, drawn by reports of the massive criminal network that had been exposed. Garrison, when he finally regained consciousness, found himself facing charges that would keep him in prison until the day he died. His surviving men were scattered to the winds, their leader's defeat having broken whatever loyalty money could buy. But for Clara and Joaquin, the real victory wasn't in seeing their enemy destroyed. It was in the freedom to choose their own path forward. 3 months later, they stood together on a hill overlooking a valley 50 miles north of the Apache reservation, watching the sun set over land that would soon become their home. Clara wore a wedding dress that blended Apache and Mexican traditions, its white cotton adorned with turquoise beads and silver threads that caught the desert light. Joaquin stood beside her in formal clothing that somehow managed to honor both his heritage and his adopted place in the white world. Buckskin pants and vest worn with a white shirt and black tie. The ceremony itself had been unlike anything the territory had ever seen. Presided over by both a Methodist minister and an Apache holy man, it represented the joining not just of 2 hearts, but of 2 worlds that had too often been at war. Judge Thornfield had insisted on attending, claiming that he needed to see at least one legal proceeding that ended with joy instead of violence. Maria Santa served as Clara's maid of honor, while Captain Mitchell stood as Joaquin's best man, their presence symbolizing the unlikely alliance that had brought down Garrison's empire. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked as they watched the last light fade from the western sky. "Leaving the Apache way completely, choosing to live in the white world?" Joaquin considered the question seriously, as he did all things. "I am not leaving the Apache way," he said finally. "I am carrying it with me into a new place. The warrior's path is not about where you fight, it is about what you fight for." Clara nodded, understanding flowing between them as it had from that first moment in Perdition Creek, when their eyes had met across a dusty street. They had both been broken by their experiences, both scarred by loss and betrayal, but somehow, those very wounds had allowed them to heal each other. "What do you fight for now?" she asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Joaquin's arm tightened around her waist, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I fight for this. For us. For the children we'll have and the life we'll build together. For the idea that two people who were told they could never be free can choose to be free anyway." In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the celebration continuing in the valley below, Apache drums mixing with Mexican guitars, the laughter of people who had found reasons to hope again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles, new choices to be made. But tonight, under the vast canopy of desert stars, Clara Bell felt something she had never experienced before in her 17 years of life. She felt at peace. "Joaquin," she said softly, using the Spanish pronunciation of his name that he'd taught her to prefer. "When you first said I was yours, back in Perdition Creek, what did you mean?" He turned to face her fully, his golden eyes reflecting the starlight like pools of liquid fire. "I meant that your heart called to mine across all the barriers of race and culture and circumstance. I meant that from the moment I saw you, I knew that my life would never be complete without you in it." He paused, his scarred hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "But mostly, I meant that you were mine to protect, to cherish, to love, and that I was yours in exactly the same way." Clara smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise after the longest night in history. "Then we belong to each other," she said. "Not as property, not as possessions, but as two people who choose to share one life." "Sí, mi corazón," Joaquin murmured, using the Spanish endearment he'd learned for her. "We belong to each other." Their kiss, when it came, tasted of freedom and starlight and the promise of all the tomorrows they would face together. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the desert wind like the blessing of ancient spirits, came the sound of Apache voices raised in the song of victory, not for a battle won, but for two hearts that had found their way home. In the end, Clara Bell learned that true freedom wasn't about escaping the chains that others tried to put on you. True freedom was about choosing who you wanted to be, who you wanted to love, and how you wanted to live, then having the courage to make those choices real, no matter what the world might say about them. She had been sold to a brutal, drunken rancher like a piece of livestock. But an Apache hunter with wolf gold eyes had stepped out of the desert shadows, called her his own, and taught her that some souls cannot be owned, only cherished, only loved, only set free to fly as high as their dreams could carry them. And in the heart of the Wild West, under an endless sky full of stars, two broken souls became whole again, proving that even in the harshest places, love could bloom like desert flowers after rain.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.